A historical backdrop. From legendary cartels to modern criminal networks. South America has long played a central role in the global drug trade. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Colombian cartels, most notably the Medellín and Cali organizations, dominated the cocaine market, generating enormous wealth and power, and even challenging the authority of national governments. Their meteoric rise and eventual dramatic falls paved the way for a more fragmented but equally resilient set of groups. Today, an array of criminal networks has evolved, each adapted to new realities: a globalized marketplace, sophisticated financial systems for money laundering, and increasingly innovative smuggling routes that now reach into Africa, Europe, and beyond. Mapping the cartels by country. Colombia. The legacy and the new order. Historical giants and modern successors. Colombia's legacy in the drug trade is, of course, inseparable from the mythos of Pablo Escobar's Medellín cartel and the business-like operations of the Cali cartel. Although both were dismantled by the 1990s, their methods and networks laid the foundation for subsequent organizations. Today, groups such as the Clan del Golfo, also known as Los Urabeños, have emerged as dominant players. Other networks like the Norte del Valle cartel, which saw its heyday in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and smaller factions like Los Rastrojos have continued the tradition of mixing brute force with cunning financial operations. Insurgent and hybrid actors. Notably, Colombia's armed insurgencies, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and the National Liberation Army, ELN, have at various times engaged in drug trafficking to fund their operations. While these groups are primarily political and ideological in nature, their involvement in the cocaine trade illustrates the blurred lines between insurgency and organized crime. Recent investigative articles highlight how even as peace processes have unfolded, remnants of these organizations continue to serve as conduits for drug shipments, complicating Colombia's internal security landscape. Government connections and corruption. Reports over the years have pointed to a disturbing nexus of corruption in Colombia. Local officials, law enforcement agents, and even politicians have, at times, been implicated in receiving kickbacks or outright collaborating with traffickers. This state capture scenario where criminal groups infiltrate local institutions undermines public trust and hampers effective law enforcement. In many regions, the presence of armed groups combined with impunity creates an environment where criminal activities flourish. Venezuela. The transit hub with a shadowy state connection. The Cartel de los Soles phenomenon. In Venezuela, the narrative is different yet intertwined. The so-called Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, refers less to a single organization and more to a network allegedly comprising high-ranking military officials who are reported to have significant control over drug shipments. Investigative reports from sources like the BBC and the New York Times have detailed allegations that some elements within the Venezuelan military have engaged in drug trafficking, leveraging the nation's strategic geographical position as a gateway to the Caribbean and beyond. Political instability and institutional weakness. Venezuela's political and economic turmoil over the past decade has exacerbated these issues. With weakened state institutions and pervasive corruption, criminal organizations find a welcoming environment in which to operate. The country not only serves as a production area in certain instances but is also a crucial transit point for drugs en route to markets in North America and Europe. Brazil. Urban gangs evolving into transnational criminal networks. From favelas to federal prisons, Brazil's drug trafficking landscape is dominated by urban criminal organizations that have evolved far beyond the local gangs of past decades. Groups such as Comando Vermelho, Red Command, Amigos dos Amigos, and the Primero Comando da Capital, PCC, have transformed from prison-based or favela-confined gangs into sophisticated, transnational networks. The PCC, in particular, has become notorious for its well-organized structure and its ability to control drug distribution routes that extend across state lines and even into neighboring countries. Government and institutional interplay. In Brazil, the challenge is compounded by systemic issues in law enforcement and political institutions. Corruption, underfunded security apparatus, and sometimes violent responses to gang activities create an environment where criminal organizations can not only survive but thrive. Detailed analyses from Brazilian media and international watchdog groups have pointed to instances where local politicians have been either complicit with or directly influenced by these organizations, furthering a cycle of violence and destabilization. Peru and the broader Andean nexus. Coca cultivation and local networks. Peru, along with Bolivia, is one of the world's largest producers of coca, the raw material for cocaine. In regions such as the VRAEM, Valle de los Rios Apurimac, y Mantaro, small-scale farmers and local trafficking networks operate with relative impunity. While Peru does not have cartels in the classic sense as seen in Colombia, the situation on the ground is no less complex. Armed groups, sometimes with insurgent roots or links to remnant ideological movements, for example, offshoots of the Shining Path, are involved in the local processing and movement of cocaine. State challenges and recent developments. Control over remote areas remains a significant challenge for Peruvian authorities. According to recent UNODC reports, the decentralization of drug trafficking operations has led to the proliferation of loosely connected networks that are harder to disrupt. This fragmentation, while initially seeming to dilute the power of any single organization, in fact creates an environment of widespread corruption and localized violence, further complicating state efforts to regulate or dismantle these groups. Bolivia and Ecuador, producers and transit points. Bolivia, the root of the coca tree. Bolivia's role in the drug trade is primarily as a coca producer. Although the country does not have a cartel in the style of Colombia's past organizations, it is a critical part of the supply chain. Local networks often operate with the tacit acceptance of authorities, partly due to political pressures and the socio-economic importance of coca cultivation in rural areas. Ecuador. Maritime routes and new challenges. Ecuador, due to its long coastline and proximity to major shipping lanes, has increasingly become a transit route for cocaine. While not home to a dominant cartel, Ecuador's logistical role has been emphasized in recent investigative articles that detail how traffickers exploit weak port controls and corrupt officials to facilitate shipments that eventually reach North American, European, and African markets. The global web, smuggling routes and international impact. Traditional routes and the northward flow. For decades, cocaine and other drugs produced in South America have made their way to the lucrative markets of North America and Europe. The well-documented overland route from Colombia through Central America to Mexico and then north into the United States remains a major conduit. Here, the blend of geographic challenges, corruption in border regions, and the sheer scale of the drug trade have allowed traffickers to continue this long-established pathway. Emerging routes, the African connection. Why Africa? In recent years, a new trend has emerged. With heightened law enforcement pressure along traditional routes and the lure of untapped markets, traffickers have begun to use parts of Africa as transit hubs. West African ports such as those in Lagos, Nigeria, Abidjan, Ivory Coast, Dakar, Senegal, and even in parts of East Africa have been identified in several reports as emerging nodes in the global smuggling network. Africa's growing trade infrastructure, combined with challenges in governance and security, makes it an attractive alternative route. How it works. Drugs are often shipped in concealed cargo among legitimate goods. Small, fast boats may first transport cocaine from coastal areas of Colombia to the shores of West Africa. From there, the drugs are hidden among container shipments destined for European markets or even directly diverted to lucrative local networks. As detailed in a Reuters investigation, traffickers have refined these methods, exploiting both technological advances in logistics and weaknesses in local regulatory frameworks. Impact on Africa and beyond. The increasing use of Africa as a transit region has several ramifications. African nations, already grappling with internal challenges, face the additional burden of corruption, increased violence, and the risk of their ports becoming synonymous with international criminal activity. At the same time, European and Asian markets where law enforcement may be less prepared for these novel routes risk an uptick in drug availability and related societal issues. The global nature of this network underscores that what happens in the back alleys of South America can quickly ripple out to affect entire continents. Governmental entanglement and global consequences. Corruption, co-optation, and the erosion of state authority. A recurring theme across South America is the murky relationship between drug traffickers and government officials. Whether it's the alleged ties between the Venezuelan military and the Cartel de los Soles, or the infiltration of local political structures in Colombian regions by criminal factions, these interactions create a vicious cycle. Corruption not only undermines the rule of law but also debilitates public institutions, leaving citizens exposed to violence and exploitation. Economic and social impact. The social cost is staggering. In countries like Colombia and Brazil, decades of drug-fueled violence have left deep scars. Communities displaced by conflict, economies stunted by the persistent drain of corruption, and a generation growing up in environments where criminality seems an inescapable norm. Internationally, the widespread availability of drugs leads to public health crises and increased law enforcement expenditures, while the money laundering operations linked to these cartels can distort financial markets far beyond South America. The international response. International agencies from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to Interpol have repeatedly called for coordinated global action. Yet, as recent articles note, the adaptability of these criminal networks often outpaces governmental reforms and international treaties. The ever-evolving nature of smuggling routes, especially the incursion into African trade hubs, suggests that future efforts must be as transnational and multifaceted as the networks they aim to dismantle. Looking forward, challenges and the path ahead. The story of South America's drug cartels is one of constant reinvention. As law enforcement in traditional markets tightens its grip, traffickers innovate, finding new passageways and forging new alliances. The interplay between criminal organizations and corrupt elements within governments creates a resilient, self-perpetuating system that is difficult to dismantle. Moreover, the expansion of smuggling routes through regions like Africa hints at a future where the global drug trade is even more dispersed and intertwined with international economic and political dynamics. Key areas for future focus. Strengthening institutions. Reinforcing the capacity of state institutions in South America and in transit regions like West Africa is essential. This means not only cracking down on corruption but also building robust systems for economic development that reduce the lure of illicit trade. International cooperation. A coordinated approach that involves intelligence sharing, joint operations, and regulatory reforms is crucial. Global agencies and local governments must work hand in hand to track financial flows, disrupt smuggling routes, and hold corrupt officials accountable. Addressing socio-economic roots. Ultimately, the drug trade thrives in environments of poverty, inequality, and political disenfranchisement. Long-term solutions require investing in education, infrastructure, and social programs that provide viable alternatives to the lucrative but destructive world of drug trafficking. Monitoring new routes. With the emergence of Africa as a key transit point, international monitoring and cooperation in maritime and land border security become more vital than ever. Advanced tracking, improved port security, and targeted sanctions against implicated networks may help stem the tide. Conclusion. The intricate web of South American drug trafficking is a story of evolution from the violent dynasties of Medellín and Cali to the sophisticated, networked operations of today's groups like Clan del Golfo in Colombia, the Cartel de los Soles in Venezuela, and Brazil's PCC and Comando Vermelho. Their connections with government officials, whether through outright corruption or complex socio-political alliances, have helped sustain these networks and enable their global reach. As drugs continue to flow from the Andean highlands to the streets of major cities across North America, Europe, and increasingly Africa, the international community is faced with a multifaceted challenge. Recent investigative reports and academic analyses confirm that while traditional routes remain important, innovative smuggling channels enabled by weak governance and porous borders are reshaping the global drug trade. Only through comprehensive, transnational efforts that address both immediate enforcement needs and the deeper socio-economic causes can there be hope for a future where the destructive cycle of drug trafficking is finally broken. To help our channel grow, please comment, share, like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to get more news.